Most people don't realize they are at war, not with the world, not with other people, but with something much closer. Something they carry with them every single day and never once think to question. There is a process running inside you right now. It has been running for years. It picks up moments from your past. It distorts them. It exaggerates them. It takes something you said last week and replays it as if it happened 5 minutes ago. It takes a small hesitation and calls it weakness. It takes an honest mistake and calls it proof. And the worst part is not what it says. The worst part is how it says it. With absolute certainty. As if it already knows the verdict and is simply reading it out loud. You know the feeling. You are lying in bed. The room is dark. Nothing is wrong. And yet your chest tightens. Your jaw clenches. Sodo. Your mind begins pulling things from a drawer you thought you had closed a long time ago. It brings them back, not as memories, but as accusations. And suddenly, a quiet room becomes the loudest place you have ever been. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a former slave named Epictetus stood before his students in a small room in Greece and said something that would outlive empires. He told them that people are not disturbed by what happens to them. They are disturbed by the stories they build around what happens. The event is neutral. The suffering is authored. And that is the part no one warns you about. The voice inside your head is not dangerous because it exists. It is dangerous because you were never taught that you don't have to believe it. Think about a moment. Not something dramatic, something small. You said something in a conversation and the other person paused. That is all that happened. A pause. But your mind took that pause and built an entire case against you. It decided what the pause meant. It decided what the other person was thinking. It decided what that says about you. And by the time you left that conversation, you were carrying a weight that did not exist when you walked in. That weight was not created by the moment. It was created by the meaning your mind assigned to it. And that meaning was never examined. It was simply accepted. As if a thought and a fact were the same thing. They are not. And understanding that difference is where everything begins to change. There is something your mind does so quickly that you almost never catch it. It moves from recording to editing before you even notice. It does not simply store what happened. It reshapes it. It adds a soundtrack. It adjusts the lighting. And by the time you recall that moment, it is no longer what actually took place. It is a version your mind created without your permission. You stumble over your words during a presentation. That is what happened. But your mind does not stop there. It decides that this means you are not intelligent enough. You miss a deadline by 1 day. That is what happened. But your mind tells you this means you are unreliable. Someone you care about does not respond to your message for a few hours. That is what happened. But your mind concludes that you are not important to them. In each case, the event was small. The interpretation was enormous, and you never stopped to notice the gap between them. The ancient Stoics were obsessed with this gap. They studied it the way a surgeon studies the space between healthy tissue and disease. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, spent his private evenings writing to himself about this exact problem. Not about armies, not about politics, about the space between what happens and what the mind decides it means. Because he understood that if you lose control of that space, you lose control of everything. And here is why most people lose that space without even realizing it. The interpretations do not arrive as suggestions. They do not knock on the door politely and ask for permission. They walk in as if they own the place. They present themselves as conclusions, as things that have already been decided. Your mind does not say, Perhaps this means something. It says this is what it means, and because it uses your own voice to say it, you assume it must be true. But it is not truth. It is narration. Your mind is not a judge delivering a verdict. It is a storyteller spinning a version. And like any storyteller, it has preferences. It has habits. It has patterns it returns to again and again. Some of those patterns are useful. Many are not. And the ones that are not useful are often the ones that feel the most convincing. When a story is repeated often enough, it stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like identity. You do not hear, "I made a mistake." You hear, "I am the kind of person who makes mistakes." The thought becomes the definition. And once it becomes a definition, it becomes very difficult to see around it. But the moment you see this process, clearly something shifts. You do not need to fight the thought. You do not need to argue with it. You simply need to step back far enough to recognize that it is a thought, not a fact, not a sentence, not a verdict, just a thought. And in that recognition, a small distance opens up, a distance that changes everything. The Stoics did not try to empty the mind. They did not sit in silence, hoping for blankness. They practiced something far more powerful. They practiced seeing clearly. They believed that peace does not come from the absence of difficult thoughts. It comes from the refusal to be owned by them. And if that idea feels like something worth exploring further, then staying with this channel is a decision toward that clarity. Not just watching, but choosing to return. Because the way you train your attention determines the life you experience. And this is a place where that training happens one video at a time. The change does not happen all at once. It begins with something so quiet, you might miss it entirely. Where you once accepted a thought instantly, you now hesitate for half a second. Where you once reacted with your whole body, you now observe from a slight distance. Where you once believed the voice without question, you now treat it as one possible interpretation among several. These shifts are small, almost invisible, but they are the foundation of everything that follows. The voice does not stop. It still speaks. It still carries that familiar tone of certainty. But something is different now. It speaks, and you listen without obeying. It presents a conclusion, and you hold it in front of you like an object. You turn it over. You examine its edges, and sometimes you set it down, not because you have defeated it, but because you have realized that holding it is a choice, and choices can be changed. Marcus Aurelius captured this in a single line that has survived nearly 2 millennia. He wrote that you have power over your mind, and not outside events. And then he added something that most people forget. He said, "Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is the ability to feel a harsh thought rise inside you and choose not to follow it. It is the ability to watch your mind react without letting that reaction dictate your next move. It is quiet. It is steady. And it is entirely within your reach. What once felt like truth begins to feel like possibility. What once felt like a verdict begins to feel like a draft. On something unfinished, something you are allowed to revise. And in that permission, a kind of freedom opens that most people never discover because they never think to look for it. Pay attention to how a thought arrives, not the content, the delivery. It does not enter your awareness like a question. It does not say, "I wonder if this is true." It enters like a statement read from a courtroom document. Final. Decided. Closed. Your inner voice does not suggest that you are not enough. It declares it. And that declaration carries a tone so steady, so familiar, so certain, that questioning it feels almost absurd. And there is a reason for that. The voice sounds like you. It uses your language. It knows your history. It references your specific failures and your specific fears. It is not a stranger offering an outside opinion. It is something that has lived inside you for so long that separating yourself from it feels impossible. When something speaks with your own voice from inside your own mind, the idea that it might be wrong does not naturally occur. You assume that what comes from within must be authentic. But authenticity and accuracy are not the same thing. The mind is designed for efficiency. It does not want to evaluate every single piece of information from the beginning each time. So it builds shortcuts. It creates automatic responses. It learns that certain inputs should lead to certain outputs. And over time, those pathways become so fast that they bypass your awareness entirely. A thought appears, and before you have a chance to examine it, your body has already responded. Your mood has shifted. Your confidence has adjusted, all from something that was never reviewed. Carl Jung identified this pattern with a warning that still carries weight. He wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That is not a metaphor. It is a description of what happens when the automated thoughts running beneath your awareness are never brought to the surface and examined. You believe you are making free choices, but you are following a script that was written without your input. This is what gives the voice its power. It does not argue. It does not present evidence. It does not try to persuade. It simply states. And because it states with the same tone, whether it is accurate or completely distorted, you have no natural way to tell the difference. Guidance and deception arrive in the same packaging, where wisdom and fear use the same voice. And without a deliberate effort to slow down and examine what is being delivered, you will treat everything the same. You will obey it all. But there is an alternative, and it begins with something so simple it is almost disappointing. You slow down. When a thought appears, especially one that carries weight, especially one that makes a claim about who you are, you pause. You do not push it away. You do not argue with it. You simply hold it still for a moment, long enough to see it, long enough to ask whether it is observation or interpretation, long enough to notice that the certainty it carries might not be earned. In that moment of stillness, you are no longer inside the thought. You are standing beside it, looking at it, and from that position, something becomes visible that was invisible before. The thought is not you. It is something your mind produced, and production is not the same as truth. A factory produces thousands of items. Not all of them pass inspection. Your mind works the same way. Once you see this clearly, something loosens. The grip that certain thoughts had on you begins to weaken, not because they disappeared, but because you stopped treating every product of your mind as though it had been personally approved by reality. It has not. And knowing that is the beginning of a completely different relationship with yourself. There is a layer beneath all of this that most people never reach. The mind is not just generating random thoughts. It is building something. It is constructing a version of you. Every repeated thought becomes a brick in that construction. Every unchallenged interpretation becomes part of the architecture. And over time, the structure becomes so solid that you forget it was built at all. You begin to believe it was always there. This is where the most damaging shift occurs. A thought that begins as something that happened slowly transforms into something that I am. You did not handle a situation well. That is an event. But the mind does not leave it there. It turns it into a characteristic. It rewrites the sentence from "I struggled with that" into "I am someone who struggles." And that rewrite changes everything. Because now you are not dealing with a moment. You are dealing with a label. And labels are much harder to remove than memories. Once a thought attaches itself to your identity, it becomes protected. Questioning it no longer feels like examining an idea. It feels like attacking yourself. The thought and your sense of who you are become so intertwined that pulling them apart feels threatening. And so most people never try. They carry the label as if it were a birthmark, something permanent, something they were born with, something that cannot be changed. But the Stoics would disagree, fundamentally. Epictetus taught that what disturbs us is never the event itself, but the judgment we wrap around it. And if the judgment can be wrapped, it can also be unwrapped. If the meaning was added, it can also be examined. Nothing about your interpretation of yourself is permanent unless you decide to stop questioning it. These interpretations harden through repetition, not through evidence. A thought you had once becomes a thought you have daily. A daily thought becomes a belief. A belief becomes a boundary. And that boundary begins to determine what you attempt, what you avoid, and how much of your life you actually allow yourself to live. None of that was inevitable. All of it was constructed. One unchallenged thought at a time. The voice in your head is not a courtroom, and you are not on trial. It is closer to a drafting table, producing sketches. Some are accurate representations. Others are distortions based on old data and outdated fears. Your role is not to accept every sketch as a finished portrait. Your role is to review, to revise, to decide which drafts are worth developing and which ones belong in the drawer. Between the moment a thought appears and the moment you respond to it, there is a gap. It is brief. It is quiet. And most people live their entire lives without ever noticing it exists. But inside that gap is the single most powerful thing a human being has access to: choice. Not the choice to stop thinking, but the choice to stop blindly following. Epictetus understood this with absolute clarity. He said that it is not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters. That response lives in the gap, and learning to find it is not a philosophy. It is a practice, one that gets easier every single time you use it. The Stoics never asked you to stop thinking. They understood that would be like asking the ocean to stop producing waves. Waves are what the ocean does. Thoughts are what the mind does. The question was never about elimination. It was always about relationship. How do you relate to what your mind produces? Do you treat every wave as a command? Or do you learn to stand on the shore and watch? Here is what that looks like in practice. A thought arrives. It says something harsh, something familiar, something that pulls your chest tight and makes your jaw clench. In the old pattern, you would step into that thought immediately. You would become it. You would follow it wherever it wanted to take you. But now you try something different. You notice it. You name what it is doing. Not what it is saying, but what it is doing. It is pulling. It is dramatizing. It is generalizing. And in that naming, you have already created distance. You have already stepped outside the current. The thought is still there, but you are no longer drowning in it. You are watching it from the bank. And then comes the question that the Stoics considered the most important filter a human being can apply. Can I do something about this? Not can I worry about it. Not can I analyze it endlessly. Can I act on it? If the answer is yes, then the thought becomes useful. It becomes a signal pointing towards something that can be adjusted. If the answer is no, then the thought is noise. And engaging with noise does not make you responsible. It makes you exhausted. Epictetus built his entire philosophy around this single distinction: what is within your control and what is not. And he was clear. Spending energy on what you cannot control is not wisdom. It is self-inflicted suffering. When you begin applying this filter, something remarkable happens to the voice. It does not disappear, but its function changes. It stops being a judge and starts becoming an advisor. It stops issuing sentences and starts offering data. Don't. Instead of telling you that you are failing, it points to the specific thing that did not work. Instead of making a broad declaration about your worth, it highlights a narrow area where adjustment is possible. The voice becomes useful, not because it became kinder, but because you started demanding precision from it. This is the difference between living in reaction and living with intention. When every thought receives the same level of emotional response, you are exhausted by noon. When you learn to sort thoughts by their actual relevance, you conserve energy for the ones that matter. Not every thought deserves a response. Not every feeling deserves an investigation. Some are simply echoes, repetitions of something old that found its way back into your awareness. The discipline is not in engaging with all of them. The discipline is in recognizing which ones are worth your time. Marcus Aurelius practiced this every single night, after ruling an empire, after making decisions that affected millions. He would sit alone and review his own thoughts with the detachment of a philosopher examining someone else's journal. He did not punish himself for the thoughts that appeared. He examined them. He asked whether they were accurate, whether they were useful, whether they pointed toward action or merely toward anxiety. And then he let the useless ones go, not with force, with clarity. But there is a trap here that catches almost everyone, and it is important to name it directly. Negativity feels productive. It genuinely does. When you criticize yourself harshly, it creates an illusion of accountability. It feels like you are holding yourself to a higher standard. It feels like discipline. It feels like the hard path that only serious people take. And because of that feeling, most people protect their self-criticism. They defend it. They believe that without it, they would become lazy or careless or soft. They think harshness is the price of improvement. But if you look at the actual results, the pattern tells a different story. The person who criticizes themselves constantly does not move faster. They hesitate more. They do not produce better work. They produce less of it. They do not feel more motivated. They feel more drained. The harshness they believed was fuel turns out to be friction. And the longer it continues, the more energy it consumes, until there is very little left for the things that actually matter. Aber there is a difference between correction and attack, and that difference determines everything. Correction is specific. It says, this particular thing did not work, and here is what can be adjusted. It is calm. It is focused. It leaves you with a clear next step. Attack is vague. It says you are the problem. It does not offer a path forward because its purpose is not to guide. Its purpose is to punish. And punishment without direction does not create growth. It creates paralysis. Listen carefully to the difference. That approach wasn't effective. That is correction. It isolates the issue. It keeps your identity separate from the problem. Now, listen to the alternative. You are not effective. That is attack. It merges the issue with who you are. It makes the problem feel permanent because it frames the problem as something inside you rather than something you did. The first version allows movement. The second version creates weight. And most people have spent years listening to the second version without ever realizing there was another option. Seneca saw this clearly when he observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The mind takes a specific situation and generalizes it. It takes one failure and projects it across your entire future. It takes one rejection and concludes that you are fundamentally unwanted. That expansion is not analysis. It is distortion. And the suffering it creates is real, even though the conclusions behind it are not. When the inner voice becomes precise, something noticeable happens in your daily life. You begin to act sooner because there is less hesitation. You make adjustments without turning them into existential crises. Mistakes become data points rather than character flaws. You stop carrying the weight of every imperfect moment because you have learned to extract the lesson and leave the rest behind. The same mind that once kept you stuck begins to move you forward. Not because it changed, but because you changed how you listened to it. This does not mean the old patterns vanish. They return, sometimes without warning. You will have days where the familiar voice comes back with all its old certainty, where it speaks as if nothing has changed, as if all the distance you created was temporary. But here is what is different now. You recognize it. You see it arrive and you know what it is. Not truth. Pattern. Not revelation. Repetition. And that recognition, even when it is difficult, is enough. Because a pattern you can see is a pattern you can choose not to follow. This creates a form of discipline that is fundamentally different from what most people practice. It is not built on fear. It is not sustained by pressure. It is built on clarity, on knowing what deserves your attention and what does not, on holding yourself accountable without holding yourself hostage. This kind of discipline does not exhaust you. It steadies you. It does not demand perfection. It demands honesty. And that honesty practiced consistently is what separates people who grow from people who simply suffer and call it effort. The shift from criticism to direction is not a dramatic event. It is a quiet turning. The voice that once held you back begins to point you forward, not because it became gentle, but because you stopped accepting vague attacks and started requiring useful information. That requirement changes the entire dynamic. The voice adapts. It becomes something you can work with instead of something you fight against. And in that partnership, a different life becomes possible. One where the mind is not the enemy, but the instrument. You will not notice the moment it changes. There will be no announcement. No clear line between who you were and who you are becoming. It happens in fragments, in small corrections that accumulate so gradually that one day you simply realize you are responding differently. A thought that once would have consumed your entire afternoon now passes in minutes. A judgment that once would have reshaped your mood barely registers. Not because you have become numb, but because you have become aware. The position has shifted. You are no longer standing inside every thought experiencing it, as if it were the walls of a room you cannot leave. You are standing slightly outside, close enough to hear it, far enough to see it clearly. And from that position, everything looks different. The thought is smaller than it sounded. The conclusion is less certain than it claimed. The fear is less justified than it felt. You see this not because the content has changed, but because your vantage point has. Where there was once an automatic reaction, there is now a pause. It is brief, sometimes barely a second, but it is there. And in that second, something extraordinary lives. The ability to choose, not to choose what thought appears. That was never within your control, but to choose what you do with it once it does. That pause did not exist before. You built it. One moment of awareness at a time. And it has changed the architecture of your inner life. Thoughts pass through your mind the way clouds pass through the sky. They arrive without permission. They take whatever shape they take, and they leave when they are ready. You did not choose them. You do not own them, and you are not defined by them. This is not a comforting idea offered to make you feel better. It is a structural truth about how the mind works. Thoughts are events. They are not identities. And the moment you stop treating them as permanent descriptions of who you are, they lose the only power they ever had over you. The mind does not become silent. It becomes organized. The noise is still there. The patterns still appear. But they no longer run the system. They are inputs, not commands. Suggestions, not sentences. You hear them and you sort them. This one points to something real. This one is a repetition of an old fear. This one deserves attention. This one deserves to be released. That sorting process is not suppression. It is mastery. And mastery does not require perfection. It requires consistency. To master yourself is not to control every thought that appears in your mind. That is an impossible standard, and chasing it will only create more suffering. To master yourself is to refuse to be governed by thoughts you have never examined. It is to insist on reviewing what your mind presents before deciding how to respond. It is to treat your inner world with the same discernment you would apply to advice from a stranger. Listen carefully, consider honestly, and then decide for yourself. There is a kind of confidence that grows from this process. It is not loud. It does not come from achievements or from the approval of others. It comes from a quieter place. From knowing that even when the voice inside you turns harsh, even when old patterns resurface, even when the familiar weight tries to return, you have something you did not have before. The ability to see it, the ability to name it, and the ability to choose a different response. That ability does not make life easy, but it makes life yours. Seneca's words return here with their full weight. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. You have seen this now, not as a quote on a wall, but as a lived experience. You have watched your mind build suffering from nothing, and you have learned that you do not have to live inside every building your mind constructs. This is often misunderstood. People believe that inner peace means the disappearance of difficult thoughts, that one day the mind will simply stop producing them. But that is not how peace works. Peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of choice. It is knowing that difficult thoughts will come, and that you are equipped to meet them without being consumed by them. The mind does not need to be empty to be peaceful. It needs to be understood. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the privacy of his own journal words he never intended anyone else to read. He wrote that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. He did not say the quantity. He did not say the positivity. He said the quality. And quality is determined by examination, by awareness, by the willingness to look at what your mind produces and decide with honesty whether it is worth keeping. In the end, the voice inside your head was never your enemy. It was an instrument you were never given instructions for. It produced noise, and you treated all of it as music. It produced fear, and you treated all of it as prophecy. It produced criticism, and you treated all of it as justice. But now you know. Not every sound the instrument makes is a song worth playing. And the moment you stop obeying every note, you start composing something of your own. That is where real control begins, not in silence, but in authorship, not in the absence of thoughts, but in the presence of someone who finally knows how to respond to them. If this reached something in you, there is another video waiting on your screen right now, one that takes this understanding even further and helps you apply it to the way you move through your daily life. Stay with it. You have already proven that you are someone who listens past the surface. That matters more than you know. Thank you for being here. This is Stoic Undertone.